Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Today we are undertaking a really rigorous philosophical journey, a deep dive into idealism that promises to connect two of the most, well, titanic figures in modern philosophy, and two figures you would almost never put in the same room.
Right. Edmund Husserl, the founder of Phenomenology, and G.W.F. Hegel, the architect of absolute idealism.
And it's an idealist investigation, but with a twist. We're focusing on the logical structures of their thought, which is already a different angle than most people take.
It is, and it's timely. Idealism, I mean, it spent decades in the academic shadows, but it is definitively back on the mainstream philosophical agenda, as they say.
And this specific deep dive, the study we're looking at, it seems to reveal something really essential about why it's coming back.
It does. The core thesis here is this surprising continuity between Husserl's phenomenological idealism and Hegel's absolute idealism.
The surprise is really the engine of this, isn't it? I mean, if you asked almost any philosophy student where Husserl and Hegel belong, they would place them worlds apart.
Completely different traditions.
Yeah. Hegel is this dense, sweeping system builder from the early 19th century, dealing with spirit, history, the absolute. And then Husserl comes along in the 20th century, and he's all about meticulously describing consciousness and going back to the things themselves.
They're usually filed in completely separate cabinets, no question.
But that separation, as it turns out, might be a massive historical and conceptual oversight.
It really is, and it's one that even some of Husserl's own contemporaries recognized. The whole line of inquiry we're following today is grounded in this crucial observation made by Martin Heidegger.
Heidegger, in his 1925 Marburg lectures, right?
That's the one. And what did Heidegger, himself, Husserl's own student, notice about this connection?
That's the fascinating part.
He stated, maybe reluctantly, that contemporary phenomenology has a tremendous amount to do with Hegel. But, and here's the key distinction, he didn't point to Hegel's phenomenology of spirit.
Which is what everyone thinks of, the big historical journey of consciousness.
Exactly. Instead, he pointed to Hegel's logic. And this is so crucial because it implies the overlap is structural, it's categorical. It's about how both philosophers believe reality is fundamentally organized.
So we're not talking about grand historical narratives of spirit or Geist. We're talking about the nuts and bolts, the fundamental structure of objects, of categories, of concepts.
Metaphysics at the deepest level, yes.
Okay, so what's our mission today specifically?
Our mission is to investigate the claim that some of Husserl's core expositions of what he calls essences, or Eid in the German, that they function in a way that is strikingly similar to Hegel's concept of the concrete universal.
And if we can actually establish that kinship, that connection, what does it mean for how we understand Husserl's whole project?
It fundamentally repositions him. It puts Husserl in this necessary hybrid philosophical territory. And this territory allows him to reconcile the two seemingly contradictory commitments that defined his entire life's work.
Which are his transcendental commitments on the one hand.
Right, the idea that the mind plays this essential role in constituting the meaning and intelligibility of objects.
And on the other hand, his realist commitments. The famous mandate to go back to the things themselves, as they are, independent of us.
Precisely. It sounds like a paradox, and for many it has been.
So this hybrid reading, it's like the perfect philosophical shield for him.
It really is. By revealing these absolute idealist commitments operating just beneath the surface of his phenomenology, we can provide the ultimate defense for Husserl against that charge that always dogs him.
The charge of subjectivism.
The pervasive charge that he's just succumbing to an unsophisticated and unattractive form of subjectivism. The accusation that the entire world and all truth is just a product of my finite individual mind.
That everything is just in my head.
We aim to show that his idealism is, in fact, constrained by objective absolute structures. He's more of a realist than people think.
Here's where it gets really interesting then, because to understand this profound reconciliation, we have to start with Hegel. We have to dive deep into the Hegelian architecture that underpins it all, this concept of the concrete universal.
Absolutely. We have to begin by establishing Hegel's own understanding of idealism. The core tenet for him, the defining phrase, is that the finite is an idealization defines idealism.
Okay, that's a dense phrase. What does that actually mean?
It's the foundational move that separates his position, which he calls absolute idealism, from simpler subjective forms of idealism.
Let's ground that spectrum a little. What's the difference between subjective and absolute idealism?
Well, think of subjective idealism. This is the view people often associate with someone like George Berkeley. Reality is ultimately reducible to the structures or activities of a finite individual consciousness.
So if I stop perceiving the tree, it ceases to exist. The famous to be is to be perceived.
Exactly. Esse es percipi. The reality of the world depends entirely on the existence and functioning of a finite mind, or maybe a collection of finite minds. Everything is relative to my conceptual limits and my experiences.
Got it. So how is absolute idealism different? It sounds like it should be even more, well, idealist.
It operates on a fundamentally different scale. Hegel's view asserts that individual objects are never truly metaphysically autonomous or self-sufficient. Every finite thing, a single person, a specific rock, a fleeting thought, is just a moment of larger processes or unities that fundamentally exceed it.
Can you give us an analogy for what it means to be a moment of a larger process that's a bit abstract?
Sure, think of a single cell in your body, or maybe a single note in the symphony. A single liver cell. If you just isolate it and define it purely by its own boundary, it makes no sense.
Right, it's just a blob.
It's just a blob. It's only intelligible as a moment, a necessary functioning part of the larger integrated whole of the organism. For Hegel, objects are the same. To define a single thing is to specify its place within a whole network of necessary universal determinations, all governed by what he calls the concept.
So the entire structure, this whole organism of reality, that's the absolute.
That's absolute spirit, yes. And this means that the concept of an object is a deep conceptual determination rooted in the structure of reality itself, not just a label that we slap on things.
And this way of thinking leads him directly to why he needed the concrete universal in the first place.
It does. He formulated it to solve just a devastating weakness in classical metaphysics, specifically the widespread bundle theory of what an object is.
The bundle theory, that's the sort of common sense idea that an object is just a collection of its properties, right?
Right.
Its redness, its weight, its roundness, all bundled together.
Exactly. Our lemon example. A lemon is yellow, it's sour, it's oval-shaped, it's fragrant. The bundle theory says the lemon is the sum total of these distinct sensory properties aggregated together.
Seems plausible on the surface.
It does. But Hegel spotted the key philosophical difficulty here. The bundle theory, while it accurately describes the properties, it utterly fails to explain the inherent unity or the cohesion of the object.
It confirms the attributes exist together, but not why they belong together in this specific way to make up this distinct thing, a lemon.
It's a descriptive failure masquerading as an explanatory success. Why doesn't the yellow just exist alongside the sourness and the oval shape without forming a single, integrated object? What's the glue?
The bundle theory has no answer for the glue.
It can't explain the necessary organizational principle. And without that principle, the object just falls apart conceptually.
So the concrete universal is Hegel's solution. It's the glue.
It is. For Hegel, individual objects have to be understood as integrated wholes like little organisms of properties, rather than just aggregated unities or piles of properties.
And what unifies them?
An object is unified by exemplifying a substance kind, or what he calls the universal or the concept. This concept is the object's essential foundation.
That foundation is what makes sure all the properties cohere in a specific, necessary way. So if you remove the universal, you don't just have fewer properties, you lose the object itself entirely.
Precisely. As Hegel argued, without that conceptual foundation, there is no saying what such an individual could still be. The object's concept is a constitutive, deep fact about that region of reality, not just some superficial category we impose for our own convenience.
This sounds strikingly different from the abstract universals we usually think of, like with Platonism. You know, the idea of perfect forms existing in some separate realm, totally divorced from the messy particulars we see here on Earth.
That is the essential contrast. Platonic universals are abstract. They exist apart from the things they govern. Hegel's concrete universals are coextensive with and inseparable from particulars. They are fully immanent within the world of experience.
So they don't transcend reality, they organize it from within.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We can use the example of doghood. We don't grasp the universal concept of doghood by looking at some perfect immaterial dog in the sky. We grasp it through particular breeds and individual dogs, particulars.
Okay.
But at the same time, a particular instance, say a specific Labrador you see on the street, is only intelligible through the general kind, doghood. The universal has to particularize itself into distinct, real things in order to become realized and known.
It's a truly codependent dialectical relationship. The universal needs the particular to be manifest, and the particular needs the universal to be meaningful.
And this view commits Hegel to a powerful form of conceptual realism. The concepts are not subjective mental tools. They are mind-independent constitutive features of reality that determine how finite objects are organized. This is the absolute idealist starting point we have to hold in our minds as we turn to Husserl.
That sets a powerful conceptual precedent. Okay, let's pivot. Let's see how Husserl's own concept of essence, his Eidos, maps onto this pretty demanding Hegelian framework. Husserl is famous for his methodology, so let's start with how he even defines the object he's investigating.
Right, so we move to the idea of essence for Husserl. He begins with a very broad definition of an object, a Gegenstand. It's anything that can be intended or thought about by a mind.
So a real physical chair, a geometrical circle, the concept of justice, even a mythological unicorn, those are all intentional objects.
All of them. And crucially, every single one of these objects, no matter its reality status, has to instantiate some essence.
The essence, then, is the necessary scaffolding behind anything that can be the focus of our thought.
Precisely. Husserl defines the essence as an invariant, the necessary general form without which an object such as this thing, as an example of its kind, would not be thinkable at all.
Necessary general form. I mean, that is an immediate structural echo of the concrete universal.
That's a huge one.
But Husserl is not a metaphysician in the Hegelian mold. He's a methodologist. So how do you get from the factual world to actually grasping this necessary form?
This requires a highly specific, very disciplined technique called eidetic intuition. It's a special form of seeing or intuitive grasping. And to access it, you have to first perform the phenomenological reduction.
Okay, we have to pause there. The reduction, the epike. For anyone listening who isn't familiar with it, what does that entail, and why is it necessary to see the essence?
The reduction is the act of suspending our natural everyday belief that the objects we encounter are just brute facts existing independently of our consciousness. You don't deny their existence, you just bracket your judgment about their facticity.
So you're not saying the chair isn't real?
No, you're just setting that question aside. You shift your focus from the actual world to the realm of pure possibility and necessity. The reduction opens up a space where we can examine consciousness's essential structures, rather than just its empirical content.
So we temporarily stop caring if the chair exists, in fact, and instead we focus only on what a chair must be structurally for it to be intelligible as a chair.
That's a perfect summary. And once you're in that attitude, the method for grasping the invariant essence is what he calls imaginative variation.
Let's walk through the steps of imaginative variation slowly. Let's use the famous table example to show how this process is way more rigorous than just, daydreaming.
Right. So we begin with a particular presentation of a table. Now, through imagination, we start varying its properties freely. We keep the table's identity constant in our mind while changing secondary characteristics.
Okay, so I'm picturing a table. I can change its color, I can change the material from wood to metal, I can make it bigger or smaller. It's still a table.
It's still a table. You can change the number of legs from 4 to 3, or from 3 to 2. It might still count as a table, maybe like a pedestal table.
But the moment we vary something that causes the object to lose its identity, that's when we've found the boundary.
Exactly. What if we remove all its legs and we remove the flat surface? Is it a table anymore?
No, it's a pile of lumber.
It's no longer a table. The essence of the table is revealed as the invariant structure that limits that free variation. It's the set of necessary characteristics, the possibility framework that must be present for any object to count as an instance of a table. You're testing the limits of what is possible for that kind of object.
That's a very clear process, and it yields two critical results that speak directly to Hegel's concern for objective unity.
The first result is that objects are never just simple sensory things. They're always already instances of pure, essential possibilities. The essence is a beheld or beholdable universal, what you could call an intuitive universal, which is irreducible to the particular factual instances through which it happens to be presented.
And it's pure because it's not conditioned by any one empirical fact. It's about possibility.
Right. And the second result is the introduction of eidetic necessity. Even though the process of variation itself is free, the essence itself introduces these thick constraints that are objective.
Wesensnotwendigkeit. Essential necessity.
Yes, and this necessity pertains to the inherent structure of essential kinds. It's absolutely critical to understand that for Husserl, these constraints are not reducible to our subjective concepts or our language or our psychological makeup. They are objective constraints on possibility itself.
Can you give us a concrete example of an eidetic necessity that isn't just about, say, the definition of a word?
Of course. Consider the essence of a physical thing, what Husserl calls the region of nature. There is an eidetic law that governs all physical things. They must appear prospectively and progressively.
What do you mean by that?
You cannot, by definition, intuit the backside of a physical cube at the same time as you're intuiting the front side. This isn't a failure of your vision. It's an essential necessity of the object's structure as a physical thing in space.
I see. So it has to unfold over time and from different angles.
Exactly. Conversely, an ideal object like a number, say the number 5, does not appear prospectively. Its entire essence is given to you at once. This structural difference is an objective, essential constraint. It's a law of being.
So the necessity isn't just logical or linguistic, it's ontological. It defines the very structure of possible being.
And this is why the common deflationary views of Husserl, the idea that his essences are just convenient logical subjects for true statements, not real metaphysical posits, are so hard to reconcile with his actual project.
They don't take him seriously enough.
They don't. His deep focus on material essences of specific regions like physical nature, consciousness, history, suggests that essential truths bear directly on the underlying structure of empirical reality. If essences were just linguistic shorthand, he wouldn't need a rigorous methodology like imaginative variation to discover them.
The necessity is baked into reality, not just our grammar. But if the essence is objective, how does consciousness fit into this? This brings us to the big problem of constitution.
Right. Constitution, or meaning formation, is arguably the central function of transcendental subjectivity for Husserl. Consciousness is required to perform the intentional acts that bring objects to appearance and bestow meaning upon them.
So without consciousness, there is no meaningful object, but that still sounds very, very subjective.
But here's the trick. Here's the constraint. Every intentional object is constituted according to its essential kind. The physical object must be constituted prospectively. The ideal object must be constituted non-prospectively. This is his concept of regional ontology.
So the object itself dictates the rules of its own appearance, but it still requires the conscious act to reveal those rules.
That is the nexus of Husserl's challenge. He has to reconcile the necessary constitutive role of consciousness, the subjective acts required to realize the object's possible ways of being given, with the claim that these essential forms themselves are irreducible to the finite minds doing the constituting.
It's a tightrope walk. If the mind creates the rules, he's a subjectivist. If the mind merely follows the rules, he's a straightforward realist.
And this is precisely where the Hegelian concept of the concrete universal offers the bridge. It is built to handle that specific tension. A universal that must be realized in a particular instance, like the constitutive act of consciousness, but is not created by that particular instance.
It's the conceptual tool he needs.
It is. The concrete universal is what allows Husserl to remain a transcendental idealist without collapsing into subjective solipsism.
Okay, now we make the direct conceptual leap. Even if we set aside the question of whether Husserl was reading a lot of Hegel, and most scholars think he wasn't, at least not until late in his career, the structure of their key concepts is just startlingly aligned in 2 ways.
2 crucial ways. First, the idea of hybrid unity, or what's called identity and difference. And second, the necessary immanence of universality in particulars.
Let's take the first one, identity and difference.
Right. So Husserl describes essences as exhibiting a remarkable form of unity. In the process of imaginative variation, let's say we're comparing 2 different shades of red, the phenomenologist notes an essential commonality, the congruence of redness, right?
Okay, they're both red.
But this happens alongside a persistent difference in hue, or saturation, or luminosity between the 2 instances. Redness is identical across all instances, yet that identity is only perceivable through the differences that distinguish the particular instances from one another.
So you can't see redness by itself. You only see it as this particular crimson or that particular scarlet.
Exactly. An essence is an identity that contains difference within it. Husserl even called it a concrete hybrid unity. The identity of the essence of red isn't grasped as some pure abstraction. It's only articulated and made manifest in terms of its difference from and connection to other instances of red. The universal requires the particular to differentiate it.
That sounds absolutely dialectical. You need that push and pull between the shared element and the varying instances to fully articulate what the essence is, much like Hegel's logic proceeds through contradiction and resolution.
And this leads directly to the second key point, the necessity of the particular. This eidetic universality has an inclusive relation to particularity. Husserl explicitly stated that universality includes in its sense the idea of a particular in general and raises it to a higher form.
What does that mean for an essence to include the idea of a particular in general?
It means that essences necessarily refer to some fact, some concrete instantiation, whether it's real or just imaginary. You cannot intuit the pure essence of a table without invoking the possibility of an actual table instance. The universal is not something separate that exists before things, anti-res. It is a universality which admits and necessitates the particularization of its own sense.
So the essence and the particular are codependent. This is a direct echo of the Hegelian universal being coextensive with and inseparable from the particular.
It's the strongest piece of evidence for their conceptual proximity, and this leads to the second major point of alignment, how this ideality exists within the concrete world. Like Hegel, Husserl insists that ideality is immanent in concrete facts, governing their structure from within.
Okay.
And here we find perhaps the most striking Hegelian claim in all of Husserl's work. It's in his Ideas too, and he says, "No thing has its individuality in itself."
No thing has its individuality in itself.
Wow. I mean, that directly refutes the idea of a metaphysically autonomous, self-sufficient object. That was precisely Hegel's critique of the bundle theory.
Exactly. And the reason no object is a mere individual is that it is always fundamentally an instance of a universal, an essence that's associated with a regional ontology.
So its individuality is borrowed, in a sense, from the kind it belongs to.
Right. The individuality a fact appears to possess is only relative to the essential kind it instantiates. And crucially, these objects and their essences are only relative to consciousness in the sense that constitution is context-sensitive. The object appears to a subject in a certain way, but the essential structure that dictates how it appears is pre-given.
So consciousness is the necessary stage lighting, but it's not the playwright who wrote the essential script. That's a great way to put it. And this framework allows Husserl to account for the dynamic nature of empirical reality. Essences, he says, are open. They are fluid types that can always take on new properties according to the constitutive circumstances of givenness.
They're not rigid then?
No, except maybe in mathematics. In the empirical world, he says, they cannot be strictly apprehended with exactitude.
Why do they have to be fluid, and why can't we just nail them down perfectly?
Well, this fluidity is necessary because empirical reality is inherently inexact and constantly changing. If essences were rigid, static, Platonic forms, they could never account for the messy, open-ended quality of our experience.
That makes sense.
And this fluidity holds only because the universal scope presupposes difference, which in turn requires determination by a finite knower. Consciousness provides the necessary condition for this differentiation by acting as the recipient, the foil, for the instantiation of universals. The universal needs to be situated in a particular spatio-temporal context by a consciousness to achieve its full realization.
That inexactitude and openness is a really crucial distinction from classical Platonism. It confirms he's talking about a dynamic, concrete universal. But I have a question. If the essential structure is fluid, and the starting point of our imaginative variation can be contingent on, say, our culture or historical context, how does Husserl avoid the charge of arbitrariness? How does he make sure this is scientific?
That is the powerful challenge levied against any such flexible idealism. It's a great question. Hegel derived his categories necessarily through the logical movement of the concept, which gives him a defense against arbitrariness. Husserl's defense relies on two mechanisms.
Right.
First, the rigor of the imaginative variation itself. You have to test all possibilities until the invariant is found. And second, ultimately, his commitment to intersubjectivity.
The collective search for the essence.
Yes. The individual phenomenologist might make a mistake or be biased, but the disclosure of essences is ultimately undertaken in a community of suitably trained subjects. The objective validity of an essence is achieved when it is confirmed across the community. Even if my starting point is contingent, the underlying necessary content of the essence can achieve a high degree of objectivity.
That grounding ensures that the universality remains bound to concreteness and is grasped intuitively, but it's not just invented subjectively. Okay, let's apply this robust framework to the philosophical pressure point, the constitution of the ego itself. This has to be the ultimate test case for the charge of subjectivism against Husserl.
It absolutely is. If the Hegelian reading holds even here, that the ego's own self-constitution is governed by laws it does not author, then it completely undercuts the subjectivist critique.
Husserl explicitly states that consciousness intends objects according to rule-governed structures that lie within it. Essential connections govern all intentional activity. But if the rules lie within consciousness, how are they not just subjective products?
Here is the key distinction, and it comes from Husserl's later work. The ego's constitutive acts, its meaning-making acts, they unfold according to laws, the all-embracing laws that prescribe the scope of transcendental acts. But these laws are not generated by those acts.
So the ego, the foundational point for all meaning-making, is itself operating under a pre-existing, non-negotiable rulebook.
Precisely. The ego is not some unconditioned source of creation. It is a conditioned exemplar. The ego itself instantiates a universal. When the phenomenologist engages in self-reflection, they are seeking the apodictic principles that pertain to this ego as exemplifying the Eidos ego.
The essence of ego.
Yes, this restriction, this Bindung or constraint, is grounded in a universal eidetic structure that applies to any possible transcendental ego.
So even in the most immediate self-aware sphere, the essence of what it means to be me as a transcendental subject, there's an objective universal law governing that structure. Immanence does not equal subject dependence.
Exactly. Essentialism prevents constitution from becoming a mere subjective product. While consciousness performs the necessary positing and authenticating acts, the bringing to appearance of meaning and existence, these connections are still subject to essential laws. The content of the law precedes the ego's act of realizing it.
How does this paradox, the ego being both the foundation of constitution and an example of a pre-given essence, how does that parallel Hegel's determination of the concept?
The parallel is very strong. Hegel also firmly rejects the idea that we, as finite individual thinkers, just form concepts arbitrarily. He thought that was naive.
So what are we doing then?
For Hegel, self-conscious thought instantiates and materializes the objective relation that already exists between the universal, the individual, and the particular. That relation is already implicit in the concept's own internal logic.
So when I reflect or when I categorize the world, I am not creating the conceptual structure. I'm just making it actual and concrete in my own experience.
Right. The finite self-conscious activity is a necessary precondition for the concept's concretization and its full self-knowledge. Hegel calls this developed form of reality, the self-determination of the idea, spirit. The most developed form of reality exhibits a self-referentiality similar to subjective self-awareness, but it is realized through, not created by, finite minds.
This view frames Husserl's method, the reduction eidetic intuition, as a rigorous, intuitive way to perform the logical explication of categories that Hegel described much more abstractly.
It does. And this framework is essential for handling the problem of integrating sociality, a domain where Hegel traditionally excels with his philosophy of objective spirit. Critics often argued Husserl lacked the resources to move convincingly beyond the individual ego.
Right. If Husserl is truly defending an objective idealism, he must be able to account for shared truth.
And he does, through his concept of transcendental intersubjectivity. Husserl argues that transcendental constitution, the whole meaning-making process, can only be completed through a community of subjects. Objectivity requires a shared universal ground.
He writes that there is only the one universal ground, that of transcendental intersubjectivity, on which all truth and all truthful being has its intentional source. That sounds like a collective consciousness is necessary for truth.
It's the move from the isolated transcendental ego to what he calls an open intersubjectivity. And this means that the objectivity of any essence and the corresponding truth derived from it is dependent upon its potential validity for any and all suitably functioning subjects. The community serves as the ultimate check on my individual subjective projections.
So the powerful conclusion of this test case is that consciousness enjoys constitutive priority. It has to perform the meaning-making acts. But that activity is profoundly constrained by eidetic laws that precede it. And it must be verified by a community of subjects. That looks like a perfect Hegelian-style reconciliation of realism and idealism.
This is the core of the hybrid solution we were looking for.
So, what does this all mean for interpreting Husserl today? The comparison to Hegel's concrete universals gives us the conceptual leverage we need to reconcile those famously contradictory strains in Husserl's work, the demands of transcendental idealism versus the demand for realism about the things themselves.
Well, first, we need to be really clear that we're distinguishing this hybrid idealist realism from simpler forms of phenomenological realism. For example, from early phenomenologists like Hedwig Conrad Martius.
Conrad Martius was a firm realist who believed essences existed independently. Where did she and Husserl diverge if they were both committed to essences?
Realists like Konrad Martius typically saw essences as self-standing, objectiveless objects, existing ante-res before or independently of space, time, or consciousness. For them, the eidetic sphere was metaphysically separate from the factual spatio-temporal sphere.
And crucially, they often rejected the need for the transcendental reduction.
Exactly. Their thinking was, if essences are just floating out there, why bother with the elaborate subjective operation of the reduction? Just go look at them.
But Husserl's position is radically different.
Radically different. For him, while the essential structure is objective, it absolutely requires a special activity of mind, the transcendental activity that's enabled by the reduction, to bring its full meaning, its structure, and its individuation conditions to our notice.
So without the reduction and the self-conscious intention of the universal particular relation, the essence just remains an implicit potentiality, not a fully constituted object of knowledge.
Right. Consciousness is the necessary condition for disclosure, and this allows us to reevaluate the two major competing interpretations of Husserl's idealism that have really dominated scholarship for decades, the ones that always threaten to pull him into subjectivism or a kind of Kantianism.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is the metaphysically constructive reading. This interprets Husserl as a strong, absolute idealist, in the sense that he believes reality is a metaphysical product of transcendental subjectivity. This is where you get claims like, if consciousness did not exist, nothing would. The mind literally creates the world structure.
And the pitfall there is obvious. Solipsism, subjectivism, and a direct contradiction of his own commitment to objective reality.
Right. The second interpretation is the epistemic reading, which is often framed along Kantian lines. This view holds that objects are metaphysically mind-independent, that's the realism, but that our subjective structures are necessary only to intelligibly grasp them.
So reality exists outside, but our mind structures how it appears, making objects unknowable in themselves, absent our subjective frameworks.
And while that secures mind independence, it reintroduces a different kind of subjectivism, where the intelligibility of reality is explained solely by the structures of our minds. Which sounds a lot like the psychologism Husserl fought tooth and nail against early in his career.
So neither interpretation fully captures the tension in his work.
Neither one does. The hybrid solution, this idealistic realism, grounded in the concrete universal, allows Husserl to capture the strengths of both while avoiding their pitfalls. The core thesis is a necessary correlation. There is an essential necessary fit between an object's possible modes of givenness, which are grounded in objective essential necessities, and a subject's active grasp of them.
So reality is relative to consciousness only because consciousness is the necessary mechanism required to disclose a specific pre-existing structure. The mind is a decoder, not a manufacturer.
Consciousness does not invent the essential structure ex nihilo. Husserl's phenomenal idealism affirms the necessity, but critically not the sufficiency, of finite minds for the disclosure of reality's basic structure. By embracing the absolute idealist assumption that reality is structured by mind-independent kinds essences, he overcomes the subjectivist charge.
He finds the objective truth not outside of consciousness, but in the constrained essential laws that govern consciousness's own activity.
And the logic is sound. This comparison demonstrates that Husserl occupies a truly unique and, I think, defining place in post-Kantian thought. He pairs his radical emphasis on the self-consciousness of the transcendental ego with a profound structural realism about universals.
So what does this all mean for us? We started with this paradoxical link between Husserl's essences and Hegel's concrete universals, two concepts that both demand universality to stand in a dialectical, inclusive relation with particularity.
And ultimately, this conceptual proximity clarifies Husserl's specific genius. His contribution, when you see it through this lens, is providing a powerful intuitive methodology, eidetic intuition and imaginative variation for intuitively demonstrating the reality of concrete universals. He gives phenomenology the tools to access and make concrete the highly abstract descriptions of necessity you find in Hegelian logic.
We establish that even the constitutive activities of the ego itself are governed by essential laws that are disclosed, not invented.
Exactly. Since consciousness's constitutive priority is itself constrained by eidetic laws, laws that define what is possible for you as an ego, as a physical being, or as a moral agent. We're left with this deep reflective question for you to take away.
Go on.
If the ultimate framework for understanding reality, including the essential structure that governs your own self-constitution, is bound by essential laws that you only disclose through focused, intentional activity, where do you ultimately draw the line between discovery and creation in your own knowledge of the world?
Do you truly create your experience, or are you merely mapping a necessary terrain that was always already there?
That's the question.